It's times like this when I would have made a comment that I am standing below the Queen. Never has the Queen looked so much better than Donald Trump's picture. So at least today I'm happy it's the Queen. Thank you and welcome. I would like to welcome one of my best friends, Francis. You have met him at some of the Wednesday night lives. And unfortunately, that's no longer happening at the moment, but I always say, he's a public health doctor, so when we go back to our Wednesday night live, I think we should have him come and speak to us on public health issues that are facing us.
Yes,
Long before she became famous for chocolate, Lady Godiva allegedly rode through the streets of Coventry, England, on horseback without the benefit of clothing. Supposedly, she made a famous ride so scandalously in exchange for her husband, Leofric, Earl of Mercia, promised to cut taxes. We can only hope that the current gaggle of candidates or parties both here and in the US who make similar promises don't follow the example of Leofric and his famous wife, Godiva.
Why not?
Similarly, in modern-day America, Donna Bell, an IRS employee, writes that she was working at her desk close to tax day, April 15, one year when an elderly woman approached her. The lady said to her she needed a thick stack of tax forms. "Why so many?" asked Miss Bell. "My son is stationed overseas," she said. "He asked me to pick up forms for the soldiers on his base." "You shouldn't have to do this," Miss Bell told her. "It's the base commander's job to make sure that his troops have access to the forms they need." "I know," said the woman. "I'm the base commander's mother." As you can see, taxes, whether you are fighting for a country, they do not forget that you should still pay your taxes whether or not you are coming back home alive or in a body bag. So most of us are sufficiently intimidated by SARS or IRS in the US and know better than to mess with them. They are mafia bosses doing jail time, not for murder or mayhem, but for failure to pay taxes on their ill-gotten wealth. Even if the money is corrupt, they still expect you to pay your taxes on it. So our talk today is on church and state, which I have subtitled A Politically Engaged Spirituality. And our reading is from Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. See, the thing is, they asked, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? This is more than simply a question about money. This is really a question about authority, especially the empire's authority over the Jewish people. Jesus is being asked whether he thinks a religiously faithful person should respect the authority of the Roman Empire. The very late Arthur Miller, the prolific playwright of Death of a Salesman and The Crucible, among others, once wrote, quote, I could not imagine a theater worth my time that did not want to change the world, unquote. I feel the same way about religious faith. It should want to change the world. The blood-dimmed tide loosed in the last century claimed more lives than all wars in all previous centuries. And the present century is filled with violence and cruelty. We seem more intent on fighting God's will than doing God's will. Therefore, the most urgent religious question is not, what shall I do to be saved? But rather, what must we all do to save God's imperiled planet? Spirituality takes various forms. In many faiths, some are very profound, while others, particularly these days, appear to be a mile wide and 1 inch deep. Urgently needed for our time is a politically engaged spirituality. I believe Christianity is and should be a worldview that undergirds all progressive thought and action. The Christian church doesn't have a social ethic as much as it is a social ethic, called to respond to biblical mandates like truth-telling, confronting injustice, and pursuing peace. What is so heartbreaking is that in a world of pain, crying out for change, so many South African churches today are basically down to management and therapy. A politically engaged spirituality does not call for theological sledgehammers bludgeoning people into rigid orthodoxy, nor does it mean using scriptural language as an illegitimate shortcut to conclusions, thereby avoiding ethical deliberations. We have constantly to be aware of hard choices informed by the combination of circumstances and conscience. We insult ourselves by leaving complexities unexamined, but never must we become so cautious as to be moral failures. For example, the income polarization in our country is more characteristic of developing countries than can be found in Europe or East Asia. Determined to funnel federal dollars to religious institutions, former President Bush was not only fudging separation of church and state, he was reneging on his constitutional obligation to promote the general welfare of all people. He was actually putting charity in the path of justice. For what the poor need today is not piecemeal charity, but wholesale justice. South Africa, with its superior constitution and advanced democracy together with the United States, remain as the only countries without a national healthcare system. South African churches need to understand that while charity seeks to alleviate the ill effects of injustice, justice seeks to eliminate the causes. Charity preserves the status quo. Justice demands liberty and justice for all, a more democratic, egalitarian future for all citizens. In the book of Numbers, chapter 11:21, Moses says, quote, "Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his spirit upon them," unquote. In his day, Martin Luther spoke eloquently about the priesthood of all believers. In our time, how about a prophethood of all believers? Universities and seminaries could greatly help. If the poor are very much on God's mind, they should have a prominent place in the curriculum. How much attention is paid to the poor in biblical studies? It's worth checking in church history, in preaching, in theology, and why in the academic world are theology and ethics so sharply distinguished? In prophetic theology, they don't even interface. They are one. And let's be clear, the goal of prophetic theology, like the goal of biblical prophets, is not to chastise, but rather to heal, to enhance, not to diminish humanity. Because as the old church father said, quote, "The glory of God is a human being fully alive," unquote. This is Irenaeus, the Greek bishop who lived around 130 AD, or he was born around 130 AD. Clearly, parish clergy could use a little more backbone. They are gumption deficient, but they also need more instruction from their seminaries to face difficult situations that lie ahead. Same-sex couples are not about to go away. Civil unions, thanks to the state of Connecticut that joined the state of Vermont in 2009, the first state to do so by legislation and not by court order, though recognized more and more, still do not provide benefits equal to those of heterosexual couples with biblical passages that condemn it. Equal to those of heterosexual married couples. The problem is not to reconcile homosexuality with biblical passages that condemn it. The problem is to make Christians face up to the fact that everything biblical is not Christ-like, and that Christians are called upon to worship the Word made flesh, not Word made words. God's politics offers a clarion call to make both religious communities and governments more accountable to key values of the prophetic religious tradition. This means to make them pro-choice, pro-peace, pro-environment, pro-equality, pro-consistent with the ethics of life. William Sloane Coffin said once, quote, "To know God is to do justice," unquote. To recognize this implacable moral imperative of the faith represents the kind of good religion that mixes well in a country where 90% of the population claims to believe in God. I find it difficult to accept that most Christians support policies that contradict religious principles so outrageously, such as land redistribution, justice, love of neighbor, ethics, and alternative worldviews. The religious right is also not going away. As Robert Kennedy properly observed many years ago, quote, "What is dangerous is not that extremists are extreme, but that they are intolerant," unquote. Almost equally dangerous, I would suggest, is the sense of superiority that keeps theologians and biblical scholars from taking on the Jerry Fowles of the world because they don't consider them worthy antagonists. I do sympathize. The delusional is no longer marginal, but they've come in from the fringe and occupy the center of power, such as we see in the US with QAnon and Donald Trump and so on. More people have to speak up than only brave journalists or others. Pollution, too, is hanging around. Scientists the world over have collected mountains of evidence against global warming, but Trump and the far right declare the jury is still out. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the universities, law schools, and their graduates, or the Lawyers for Human Rights, whose president I think is quite a brilliant person, were to mount a suit against the government for failing to provide for the common defense of the environment or provision for the poor among us, as Section 27 has done for our poor school children? The suit might be called frivolous, but its guaranteed publicity would make a wonderful educational tool. To religious believers, global warming is a reminder that nature has been divorced from nature's God. They must rewed, because finally, only reverence can restrain violence, be it against each other or against nature. And lastly, in spite of all the treaties signed among global powers, nuclear weapons have only continued to proliferate. Prophetic theology would declare that only God has the authority to end all life on the planet. All we have is the power, and a politically engaged spirituality would point out that what the nuclear nations are practicing is nuclear apartheid. A handful of nations have arrogated themselves the right to produce, deploy, threaten to use nuclear weapons while policing the rest of the world against their production. Such an arrogant policy is not politically expedient, not in the long run. Nuclear apartheid has no more chance of succeeding in the world than did racial apartheid in South Africa. The only way to stop nuclear proliferation is to recognize that nuclear weapons demand a single standard, their total abolition, ours included, under the most stringent possible international control. A policy that keeps the world only minutes away from annihilation is a fine example of fighting, not doing God's will. Kofi Annan, or the late Kofi Annan, the Ghanaian former Secretary General of the United Nations, when he was still at the United Nations, said that the abolition of nuclear weapons was at the top of the UN agenda. Why isn't hunger and poverty heading the agenda of every church, temple, or mosque? Abigail Adams, the closest advisor of John Adams, the late President of the United States back then, she said this: great necessities call out great virtues. We have the former, now is the time to demonstrate the latter. Despair is not an option, for if we give up on justice, we give up on peace, and we give up on God. Therefore, in Isaiah's words, let us mount up with wings like eagles. Let us run and not grow weary, walk and not faint, not until the day when faith and hope are outdistanced by sight and possession. And in the prediction of the psalmist, the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of God as the waters cover the sea. I will close with two more quotes from Arthur Miller. You can see he's one of my favorite playwrights. The first one is, he says, I don't know why it is, but every time I reach out for something I want, I have to pull back because other people will suffer. And the second one, and the final one, says, quote, if a person measures his or her spiritual fulfillment in terms of cosmic visions, surpassing peace of mind or ecstasy, then he or she is not likely to know much spiritual fulfillment. If, however, he or she measures it in terms of enjoying a surprise, being warmed by a child's smile, or being able to help someone have a better day, then he or she is likely to know much spiritual fulfillment. Amen.
Our second hymn is a patriotic anthem sung to the music of Gustav Holst.